we certainly didn't expect what has happened, which is a tripling of business since mid-February, really. A huge, not just a slight upturn in business, but an absolutely huge upturn in business with people doing home record.
Welcome to Audio Technology Magazine's ISO Booth podcast, where we phone audio engineers and producers at home, and thanks to the pandemic lockdown, they answer.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Audio Technology ISO Booth podcast. I am here with the CEO of Aston Microphones, James Young, who's joining us all the way from the UK. Thanks for joining us, James.
Very welcome. It's nice to be with you.
So, while the world has been in lockdown lately, it seems like the Aston team has been anything but idle. Why don't you tell us a bit about what you're up to?
Just as you know, I think we've just launched product, which is as we're touting it, the world's first people's microphone. The idea of which is that we're getting the public to actually vote on the sound of the microphone as it develops. But not just kind of like submitting some final designs, but right at the beginning of when we think we've got a baseline for the audio. So we're expecting to go through several rounds of revisions publicly to get to the end product that people like.
So with, do you want to just tell us about how the idea of this blind testing isn't new to Aston? In fact, most of your mics have been created through this process, haven't they?
They have indeed. Yeah, we've got something that we call the Aston 33 panel, which is a group of some of the world's top engineers, producers and artists. And when we actually founded the company in 2015, the first products that we developed, the Origin and the Spirit, were developed in collaboration with this panel, which has since grown. So the reason it's called the Aston 33 is because originally there were 33 members. And we're talking about people like Rick Simpson, who did the last 5 Coldplay albums, and Chris Porter, who's George Michael's producer engineer for 11 years, and so on. You know, they're all big name producers, artists, and engineers. And they became the ears of our development for the product. So it's a very unusual way that we develop the mics. Most companies will, of course, get a product to nearly completion and then do what's called beta testing, where they will fire out their product to various different people to listen to and tell them what they think and whether there's any adjustments they can make. But we start that process with the audio right at the beginning, with a panel of some of the top professionals in the world. And that's grown. So when we moved to Starlight, we had about 70 or 80 people working on it. And then Stealth, which was the most recent product that we won the NAMM 2020 Tech Award for, which is incredible for a company that's only 4 years old.
Yeah.
We were having released our first product in early 2016. The Stealth had just over 120 people on the Aston 33 panel working on it. And that panel is actually about 600 people strong. So it was about a fifth of the people that we work with as artists, producers, and engineers engaged in helping us to develop that product. And we were looking at new product development, as we always are. We're a couple of years ahead of what people see out in the marketplace. We were looking at what next before we'd even got the Stealth out, of course, early last year. And came up with the idea of actually opening this process up to the customers that buy our products every day. So a much wider audience, but potentially millions of people. And we're hoping to get something in the region of 10,000 people engaged in the process of actually helping us develop the audio, so that it really is a mic that's been designed by our customers in terms of what it sounds like. It's a big project. It's pretty scary. Obviously, because nobody's ever done this before, but we like being a little edgy with what we do, and it's been pretty good. The reaction so far, and we only launched on the 1st of May, so that's 12 days ago. We've already got about 1,900 people registered to vote.
Yeah, awesome.
So it's a good start.
So tell me how you go through the process of assimilating all those opinions and preferences and also making sense of them and then turning that data into actual changes in your R&D team. Okay,
that's a lot of questions in one go. Okay, so the process is slightly different with Element to what it has been before with the microphones, because before everything was done by hand. So the data was gathered by email. We would record the audio files. We would send them out by email, or I would send them out by email to the panelists, and they would then go and listen to them in a session there, and I would get emails back to me telling me what the results were. And it's the same process, i.e. ranking the audio files from 1 to 5, and then when we were doing it with the Aston 33 panel, we'd get subjective comment as well. You know, why they didn't like the one that they put bottom, why they liked the one they put top.
Right.
And because it was, in inverted commas, only 120 people, it was still possible at that point to sift through the data manually and get a good sense of what people were talking about. You know, it's still a small enough sample set that it didn't completely overtake my life doing that. But it was still a hell of a big job. When you've got, multiple different sources across multiple different rounds with 120 people, I think the number we ended up with was about 9,500 different data points for Stealth, and it's why it ended up sounding so good, because we had 4 voicings on it as well. So it was a big multiple data set to look at. Obviously, now we're looking in the region of something like 3 rounds of testing, each with 15 different audio files, and potentially up to 10,000, maybe more than 10,000 people involved in the whole process. With the data bit, that's pretty easy because it's all been done on the back end of a website, and we can dump that data as an Excel spreadsheet, and then we can just sort it and see, exactly what people think. So every round is going to have acoustic guitars, female vocals, male vocals, because that's going to be the main use of the product that we're designing. But still, it's a lot of data to sift through. So the way that we look at the data is we go, okay, so what's winning on guitar, what's winning on female vocals, what's winning on male vocals, and then we average the data and say, okay, what's winning overall? Because at the end of the day, it's highly unlikely that you can get a microphone that wins on every section. In fact, we've never found that. It's why we end up developing things like Stealth that have got different voices for different applications. So whenever we do testing stuff, we have never ever, with all the competitor mics that we put in there and all the iterations that we've done ourselves, we have never found one mic which consistently wins all the different categories of source material across the board. So what we're looking for is to do well in the key areas, and acoustic guitar and vocal is, of course, the most important areas, although they're quite different sounds as sources. And then we look at the average data to see, okay, so how are we doing compared to the other mics that we put in there from general market overall? And it's an overall good score that we're looking for, something that does well across the board.
Yeah.
The subjective data, when you've got 10,000 people, that's a hell of a lot more difficult to look at.
Yeah.
But what we've done on the back end of the system is basically just put a text box in for the best and the worst mics, so that we only get subjective data for what people vote as best and worst. And then overall, we will then pick the product, whichever one it is, that has done best and which one has done worst, and just look at the comments surrounding those phones. So it kind of pares down the amount of sifting that we've got to do. But still, it's a hell of a lot of work. From there, I'll have a meeting with my chief designer, a guy called Trevor Zink, who's a mad professor genius, and he's one of those people that if you say, okay, well, the general consensus is we need to do something which makes it sound a little bit more open. He knows what that means. He knows how to do it. He knows how to change the electronics, and he'll give me several iterations of, a sense of more openness, for example. Or more punchy bass. So he's very good at taking sort of subjective commentary about how something should sound in a non-technical way and turn it into something technical.
Yeah, you'd imagine that's a big part of the challenge, isn't it? So it's cool that you've got a person on team who can, I guess, interpret all that feedback. With having 5 iterations of Element, from what I understand, you've got 5 different prototypes of Element in the shootout lineup, along with other standard microphones that people will be familiar with. So what is actually different between the 5 prototypes? Is it like capsule, electronics, a whole bunch of things?
Yeah, it's slightly different to that. So in previous mic development, we've done testing on capsules and we've done testing on electronics. And internally for the Element, we've already decided what capsule we're going to put in there, because we've actually designed a brand new type of capsule technology.
Right.
It's not a condenser microphone. It's not a ribbon microphone. It is not a dynamic microphone in any sense of the traditional sense of the word. So we've actually done something completely new. So the capsule was already done. The electronics. The three things really that affect the sound of a microphone are the chassis design, so the headstock, what the space around the capsule. We always design that in conjunction with the capsule choices that we're making. So those two things are done very concurrently. So the chassis design was actually finished many months ago, towards the end of last year, along with the capsule choice. So the chassis design, the capsule, and then the electronics, and they all play key roles in the final sound of the microphone. So we've decided the first two because we've had to, because it goes hand in hand with the fact we've designed new capsule technology. The bit that we're leaving to the public is the electronics, effectively. But that can have a massive impact on the final sound of the microphone. Even if you just think in terms of what you could potentially do with hardwired EQ, of course, it's very easy for people then to understand how you could raise treble, lower it, raise bass, lower it, but we can do so much more with the dynamics of the microphone than just that. And so we're not having yet, we probably won't until we get towards the final stages of testing, have 5 iterations of Element, because the first thing that we've got to do is make sure that we are getting a sound that people like when compared to some of the other market-leading microphones. And so in the first round, we've got 4 of the top brands in the world with their top products, best-selling products, and we're putting those up against the Element. And we expect in the early rounds to have work to do, because the idea is not that and I think people would be pretty skeptical if we came out and said, oh yeah, we won round 1, so we are expecting to need to do work, but the idea is to see which way the general public guide us, and it'll be interesting to see if it's different to how the Aston 33 people professionals have guided us before. So there's a lot of unknowns in this, which are a little bit scary, like I said, but very interesting.
That's interesting that you've already decided on your capsule and doesn't take on any of those traditional condenser, dynamic, or ribbon definitions. Can you elaborate on that, or is it too early?
I've given you about as much information as we're happy to give out until we release the final specs of the product, because obviously we don't want our competitors jumping all over it and seeing if they can emulate it, which is what tends to happen. Especially if you're an innovative company like we are. But what I can tell you is that it will be phantom powered. So you can think of it as something that works like a condenser and has very similar tonal and performance attributes to a condenser mic, but it isn't a condenser. It's got incredibly fast transient response, and for your subscribers that don't know what that means, that's you're talking about the speed at which for example, if you hit a snare drum and a transient response is the speed at which the capsule reacts to that, and the faster it is, the more accurate it is. So it's got a very accurate high frequency response, if you like. And it's got extended bass frequency response as well, which we can do a lot with. So because if something is there, it's easy to take away from it. But if it isn't there in the design, then it's very difficult to add it in. So we have a lot of additional audio information that you wouldn't normally get from a standard condenser or dynamic capsule available for us to play with to create the sound. It should be very interesting to see what we end up with.
That's fascinating. And so far, all your mics have had something crazy about them. Like the Origin had a smashable head, the Starlight had a laser pointer built in, the Stealth has its own built-in preamp. Does the Element have something crazy of its own that's built into it?
Well, I think what I've told you about the capsule technology is pretty crazy. If you think about ribbons and dynamics and condenser microphones, they've been around for, well, in some cases more than 100 years, the technology for that, and it hasn't really changed much in that time. and we've come along now and done something completely unique. So that's pretty crazy. But also the look of the microphone, again, which I can't detail about, but we've done something very different in terms of how the mic looks. But as with all of our product, the looks aren't the driving factor. The driving factor behind the design and how it looks is the audio. And in order to get the best out of the capsule that we've made, we've actually introduced a very different type of headstock to anything you will have ever seen before.
Right.
It really doesn't look like all the other mics out there in terms of the top end of the microphone. And that is all to do with how the source audio is guided to the capsule, and how the sound is diffused around the capsule and the space around the capsule. So yeah, I mean, it looks pretty funky as well. Yeah, and I nearly said something else which I'm not supposed to say. Sorry. Yeah, so there are some other bits and pieces that you'll find in the next month or two are very novel and architecturally what we've done with the product.
Yeah.
I can't say any more than that.
So if people want to be part of this journey of just having their say, where do they need to go? What do they need to do?
That's pretty simple. I mean, if there's a voting area on the website, so if they go to astonmics.com and they navigate through the mic section at the top of the page, they'll immediately see Project Element in there. And there's a landing page which tells you in much more detail all about the background to Project Element, how we've recorded the audio, how we're setting the whole thing up. And you can register to vote on that page. So then it's just a question of giving a little bit of background information about your recording setup so that we can check that when we're looking at the data that we're not getting bias results. So for example, one of the things that we can do is look at the data from a perspective of who's listening on headphones, who's listening through speakers, who's using a DAW and who's listening to it on an iPod, because obviously if we find major differences, which I would possibly expect to, with a cohort of people listening on mobile devices with earbuds compared to people listening on a DAW with speakers, then obviously we're going to take that into account. Because when it comes to mixing and recording, you want to know what the people that are listening on headphones using a DAW think, primarily. And if there is a difference, it'll be interesting to tell the public about that as well.
Yeah, it's very exciting. All the best with the launch. Such a unique launch concept, and looking forward to grabbing one for review once it's out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I can't let you go without asking you some kind of question about COVID. So since we're both part of the music industry, I guess from your perspective, it would seem like a mic manufacturer would be doing well at this time, because so many musicians who would have been on tour have had to cancel their shows and they've all gone back to the studio, and a lot of them have gotten busy making music and I guess connecting with their audiences online. But it's hard to imagine the music industry is going to just bounce back as soon as all this is over, and it might not come back to normal overnight. So I guess, what are your personal thoughts or observations or predictions on how things might change going forward for our industry?
Yeah, it's mystic big time, isn't it? The whole crystal ball about around COVID-19, we've been completely taken by surprise with it. I mean, it's kind of easy to say, I think, with 2020 hindsight, oh yes, of course, music technology has done pretty well during lockdown. But 6 weeks or so ago, we were looking at things and going, okay, well, are we going to have to try and operate on 50% of our usual business, 20%? Are we going to have to mothball the company because nobody will be able to afford to buy anything for 3 months and then reopen production? We really didn't know. We certainly didn't expect what has happened, which is a tripling of business since mid-February, really. A huge, not just a slight upturn in business, but an absolutely huge upturn in business with people doing home recording. So then looking forward, normally you would say, as you come through the summer, which is always a lull so the way that it works in music technology is that the touring industry does really well in the summer, and the recording studio industry does really poorly, and then it flips, and the home studio business does really well from September through to sort of April time. So obviously we're seeing something completely unprecedented, which is a massive increase in business just at the point in time that we'd normally see quite a significant decrease, 20 or 30% decrease in business. So what happens when we come out the other side of this? I mean, who the hell knows? But I've spoken to a lot of bands and artists over the last several weeks, many of whom have had to cancel tours at the last minute, many of whom have been cancelling album releases because they can't tour. And so they are all pushing off the album releases until lockdown is over. And then you think, well, what decisions are they going to make when lockdown maybe sort of eases off and we're entering winter? Are they still going to launch an album and then try and tour it in the wintertime? Because that's not traditionally how things have been done. So it's very difficult to understand how it's all going to play out. But part of the reason that the touring season is you get these seasons between touring and studio is because generally people don't want to tour an album when it's cold. They want to be in the studio when it's cold and dark. So that tends to happen. I mean, obviously your southern hemisphere, so it's slightly different, but globally that tends to be driven by America and European music markets. So you tend to see touring seasons happening from April through to September, October. It's likely that lockdown is going to finish around the time that touring season usually finishes. So then are we going to go to more recording time? Maybe. I just don't know. We're being very cautious, and we're looking at the business that's happening at the moment as banking stuff for when lockdown finishes and people want to get back out and tour again. But we just don't know. Yeah. We really don't. I don't think anybody does. We'll see.
Definitely a lot of uncertainty, but it's great that you guys can still, I guess, make it work and still keeping busy making new products. And I think it is cool that it's forcing artists to learn how to connect with their audiences in a whole new way, and that might create some shifts in the industry that'll last a long time. And it could be for the better. Only time will tell, I guess. So. Yeah,
it's been very interesting seeing the kind of all the bands doing the live sessions or recording separately at their own homes and then putting videos together. It's been pretty cool watching the whole music community respond to this very differently to how things were even a few months ago. And I do hope that we get a continuation of that part of it, because the creativity has definitely risen up
for sure. The
last few months for sure.
Well, James, thanks so much for joining us and for telling us about Element. Again, if you're listening and you want to know more, you can find the information on audiotechnology.com, or you can head straight to astonmics.com and get involved.